Open your cerebral cortex and shift your lobes into upper beta phase, because you are going to have Bitcoin knowledge transmitted directly into your vestibulocochlear. Your host at Bitcoin Knowledge is Trace Mayer, an early Bitcoin advocate since it cost $0.25, but this is not intended to be investment advice. A doctor of jurisprudence, but this is definitely not legal advice. And an investor in core cryptocurrency infrastructure, including Armory, BitPay, Kraken, and Mitagio, but this is not a recommendation of those services. Here, you get fed via direct mind download with pure and free Bitcoin knowledge.
Welcome back to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast. We have an outstanding interview today. We have two of the giants, the legends in the industry. We have Dr. Adam Back and also Gavin Andresen. Gavin, welcome to the podcast, the two of you.
Thanks.
Obviously, Mr. Back's background, cited in the Bitcoin white paper, cited in the Tor white paper, worked for decades in the digital currency industry, and then also the PhD in distributed systems. And then Mr. Andresen has been involved in Bitcoin since the earliest days. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how Satoshi turned the project over to you in those early days and how nobody else was really working on stuff here.
Satoshi tricked me.
He tricked you?
He did. He asked me if it'd be okay if my email address was on the bitcoin.org homepage. And I said, okay, and he put my email address there and took his away. And so then suddenly I was the guy who everybody contacted about Bitcoin. And then a few months later, he actually stepped back completely and disappeared.
Now, isn't that interesting? I don't know. Somebody take the alligator. Right?
That's right.
It's great to have the two of you, absolute legends in our space. You've definitely earned your place in Bitcoin history. Hopefully, Thamos over at the Bitcoin subreddit will let this interview or discussion or whatever see some traction. Maybe you have something to say about that.
Communication at the Amsterdam conference, I think it was last year, part of my talk about the state of Bitcoin, I said we need a better communication technology. Online discussions often suffer from really poor quality. Any efforts to increase the quality of online discussions, I appreciate. I think Thamos screwed up. He did the wrong thing in this particular case, trying to control the debate. And you don't want to, I think the only dimension you want to control debate is to make sure that people are polite to each other, that they talk about ideas and not...
Keep it professional.
Keep it professional, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess you can guide the debate, but you can't control it.
Right.
You try to control it, you're going to get this Streisand effect.
Exactly.
It's going to cause you're going to lose a ton of credibility because So anyways, here we are. So let's, I guess we could get started with some science fiction, maybe talk about some snarks or something. Or we could just jump right in.
We don't have a whiteboard, so I don't think we can talk about snarks.
Oh, we can't talk about snarks?
In podcasts, yeah, no.
They don't work in podcast format?
I don't think they work in podcast format, no.
So, Gavin, you've been kind of a big proponent of increasing the block size limit. And, to just kind of start, we're talking about, we currently have a block size limit of 1 megabyte. Is that a lot? Is that a little in terms of size?
It's really little. So this is 1 megabyte every 10 minutes that needs to get propagated all across the Bitcoin network to all of the what we call full nodes, those that are validating every single transaction. And to put it in perspective, the average web page these days is 2 megabytes. So the limit right now is like half a web page every 10 minutes needs to get transmitted across the network. And that's just ridiculously small. I proposed initially 20 megabyte blocks, which would be, 2 web pages a minute worth of transaction data, and there's overhead, and there's all sorts of others. I'm waving my hands. You can't see it on a podcast.
That's what wizards do.
the latest proposal, BIP 101 that I proposed, went down to 8 megabyte blocks, which I think is just kind of on a if you look at the network capacity of typical like home internet users, if you look at network capacity of nodes in data centers, 8 megabytes shouldn't be a problem for anybody anywhere in the world to still participate as a fully validating node, assuming they have a pretty reasonable internet connection. You don't need a super duper high fast gigabit Google fiber connection to keep up at that block size. And so I think that's a reasonable place to start. And I think we should scale up as technology grows, because we see announcements every week of 5G data on cell phones that's going to bring gigabit type bandwidth to these devices we have in our pockets that are now running with 32 or 64 gigabytes of memory and faster processors. So I've been around long enough to see that technology does advance, it does get faster, and I think we need to scale up to follow those trends.
So, how about that, Adam? Is increasing the block size going to help increase scalability, or is it just going to increase the throughput? And is it really comparable? Comparing a 2 megabyte website with this block that needs to be distributed among a lot of different nodes. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. So we saw the BIP 66 4th of July fork that happened back on the 4th of July, and what happened, it's just a protocol upgrade that everybody was happy to see deployed, and the network accidentally forked. And it turned out the reason for that is that many of the miners were so-called SPV mining, or not validating the blocks. They were relying on other miners to validate the blocks. And the reason that it's assumed that they were doing that was to reduce their orphan rate and therefore their profitability. So the cost of actually transmitting the blocks, like the latency of transmitting the blocks during which there'd be a mining disadvantage, and the validation time to check them, they calculate to be enough that they were willing to take this risk. And people knew that there was a little bit of SPV mining going on, but it was only when this soft fork deployed that they realized it's actually significantly in excess of 50%. So I think that shows that, it's more the orphan rate and that kind of thing, at least from the mining side. I mean, there are two sides to the overhead. One side is the miners. They have to run full nodes to do mining, and apparently they're cutting corners because of the block transfer time and the validation time. And I mean, it's also a broadcast network, so you're really talking about sort of the time to broadcast this all through the network. You want the ratio between the block propagation time and the block creation interval to be reasonably high, so that the percentage of orphans is quite low, because orphans are expensive for miners. So the other thing Gavin was talking there about the rate of data growth. So apparently there's some data that shows that the data is still increasing, obviously, but the rate of increase is slowing, and the kind of dollars per megabyte. So we're paying more for our bandwidth these days. Like, our bandwidth bill per month may be higher. We can buy more, and it's possible to buy bigger plans, relatively speaking, in terms of 50% above or 100% above the median or something. But there is some kind of S-curve going on, so it's not necessarily that this is going to increase exponentially. So the other data point, we were just talking about this a minute ago, is the bit theory paper. They've made some claims, and I guess we'll maybe hear some more about that during the workshop. That already at 2 megabytes, they think that 40% of the nodes will drop off the network for presumably bandwidth cap or bandwidth transfer limits, and 95% at 8 megabytes. And I know the Chinese miners, when they, as far as I understand it, when they put out their 8 megabyte suggestion, I think that was the kind of maximum limit that they felt they could support, whereas BIP 101 proposes to use it as a starting point and go upwards from there. So my personal preference for a kind of compromise block size increase strategy for the short term is to start at 2 megabytes, so like a 248, so start at 2 megabytes and grow to 4 megabytes over 2 years and 8 megabytes over a total of 4 years. And then we can reevaluate how a bunch of stuff has played out in terms of, what's bandwidth doing, what's the decentralization health of the network at that point, and how have scaling technologies like Lightning and other things and extensibility frameworks, how have they played out in practice? We think they will work well, but we should see them in action before we make scaling decisions based on them. So I think it's going to be more conservative and easier to agree if we have a shorter time frame within which projections are happening. So, with BIP 101, it increases for 20 years. And I think BIP 103 by Peter Ruller increases for 35 years or something longer, but at a lower exponential growth rate.
Yeah, I mean, let's see, Gavin, 2-3 years ago, we were at the San Jose conference together.
Yeah.
How in the world has Bitcoin changed since then? And if we're looking at how fast Bitcoin mutates and changes, then I mean, why would we want to be planning out a block size increase over like a 20-year period? I mean, are there going to be advantages to that, or is there like some merit to this more slow and measured approach to increasing the block size?
I mean, I like predictability. That's one of the things that drew me to Bitcoin, is the rules are very predictable. We know how many Bitcoins are going to be issued 50 years from now. And we know how many Bitcoins are going to be issued all the way up through, like the year 2140. And so when I proposed a 20-year time frame for BIP 101 to scale up, I looked at kind of the predictions for Moore's Law, kind of the predictions for bandwidth increases, and it looked like the experts were saying, we've got 20 years, that the roadmap looks pretty clear. Beyond that, it gets really, really fuzzy. I mean, maybe Adam's right. Maybe the only proposal that can get consensus would be something shorter term. I mean, the good news for Adam's 248 proposal is I know the lines of code I need to change in BIP 101 to make that happen. So the code's already written. And it would actually just drop right in quite nicely. Just need to change some constants. I'm going to be listening a lot at this conference, at this workshop, to see what other people think. Right? I don't think it's up to Adam and I to decide what the right answer is. And
I mean, this conference has some really big names, and who've had substantial impacts on decentralized systems and other things. We've got Bram Cohen, who invented the BitTorrent protocol, which has similar issues that Bitcoin does.
Bram, because I mean, I wonder if he has any statistics on like the typical BitTorrent user and what their connection looks like. Because the typical BitTorrent user is probably a lot like the current typical kind of Bitcoin full node user.
What do you think about that, Adam? In terms of like what node, like how many fully validating nodes versus SVV needed nodes are there? What is this typical Bitcoin user that we've got? And is it really necessary for us to have a single implementation of the software or the consensus code in order to serve that user? Or should we have multiple different implementations of the consensus code?
Well, the last part first, I think it's more conservative, at least right now, to have one kind of consensus implementation. I mean, Bitcoin is basically defined by the consensus C++ code. And that's why there's this work ongoing to package that up into libconsensus, so that if somebody wants to write a Bitcoin daemon tuned for different purposes or in different languages, they can link to this library and then be guaranteed, closer to guaranteed, bit for bit consistency. You know, we've seen cases where even Bitcoin D has conflicted with different versions of itself, so it's already high enough risk without, you know, re-implementing it. The consensus part of it in other languages, but that's more of a micro level detail.
Yeah, but we have lots of different species of life on the Earth. It's that diversity of life that makes it so anti-fragile and really gives it a lot of its ability to survive and thrive despite lots of different catastrophic risks that can come in there. I mean, what do you think about that, Gavin? Different implementations. There already are some out there.
There are. I've actually been playing with Conformal. It's BTCD, but I think Conformal just changed their name, which is an re-implementation of Bitcoin in Go, the Go language. And it's pretty good. You know, I don't know if it's 100% consensus correct. I do know they found some consensus kind of edge cases that we weren't testing for in Bitcoin Core before, and we are now because they contributed patches so that, you know, we're looking for those edge cases and making sure that as we change Bitcoin Core, we don't accidentally, you know, trigger one of those edge cases that causes Core to become inconsistent with itself. And I mean, the very fact that we've had a couple incidences where Core was inconsistent with itself, and we did have blockchain forks. So
what would be an example? BIP 66?
BIP 66 was a fix that we had to keep quiet. It was this weirdness in OpenSSL that could have caused systems running on 32-bit machines to disagree with systems running on 64-bit machines, running identical software. So the 32-bit machines would reject some transactions that the 64-bit machines would accept because of tiny little detail in the OpenSSL implementation. So that's actually a pretty good example. BIP 66 fixed that. And Peter Vola is brilliant and found it because he's a very careful engineer and was doing work on replacing the OpenSSL signature validation with his libsec p256 library. And so I think with careful engineering, you can find these issues, you can kind of flush them from the system, and we've been doing that over the years. And at this point, I don't think there are a whole lot more of those left to be found, right? The code that we see has been explored multiple times by multiple implementations, by lots and lots of people. We're finding really edge case bugs in the OpenSSL implementation, which we're flushing out of the system. So 3 years ago, I think I would have agreed with Adam that it was much too risky to have more than one implementation. Today, I think the risks are manageable, right? I mean, Core has forked itself; it got fixed.
Yeah, Dr. Woolley seems to be Superman in a lot of these cases.
He is. Yeah, Peter's fantastic.
What about this decentralized nature of writing the software then? You know, having multiple reviewers, having multiple committers. I mean, do we as an industry really have those resources today? Or are we growing up enough to kind of implement this vision that would make us more resilient? Or we assume it would make us more resilient?
I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to get up the learning curve to really understand all the issues of consensus well enough to be a really good reviewer, to be a really good, I want to say penetration tester, but that's not the right word. Somebody who can look at the code, can kind of see issues that might exist there that might break consensus. We do have those people. Code review continues to be a huge bottleneck for innovating with Bitcoin Core. I think that's one of the reasons why I would like to see more experimentation with other implementations, frankly, so that a person maybe who's an expert in Go can look at the Go implementation and make sure find edge cases there. And having one code base, I think, is becoming a bottleneck for innovation and for experimentation. Maybe lib consensus will help fix this, if lib consensus ever gets done, then there's this reusable library that's rarely touched. I don't know. We'll see.
So I wanted to say something about the complexity of keeping two re-implementations of a network protocol bitwise perfect. So we've had a reasonably good time so far because people have, I think, kind of held back the people that would normally attack network protocols like Bitcoin, and they don't want to damage it. But if we got some focused attacks in the kind of 0 days that get developed and sold to NSA or sold to the highest bidder or used by black hats and kept secretively until they get released, I think these kind of bitwise inconsistencies can be exploited to steal money from people who transact Bitcoins quickly. So some companies are, they're doing 0 confirms or 1 confirms and they're bridging the difference. And so for them, they could lose money. And just to talk about the complexity of it, so there's this really interesting paper by Dr. Meredith Patterson, which is talking about programming language from a formal language point of view. And so she reaches actually some conclusions about the types of messages you should write on the protocol, because the messages between a distributed system are like a form of language. Like the messages that Bitcoin sends on the network, they're a language. And so it's not talking about the language that you implement the nodes in, but the language of the communications in the network. And what she says is that it's a whole exploration of language security. And basically what she's saying is this is like NP complete. It's a lot more complicated than people anticipated it would be. And so this is partly an explanation of why software keeps getting exploited over the network. It's just much harder than we thought it would be. But the interesting, there are conclusions in the paper which are, guidelines on what not to do, which aspects of the message, the types of messages, the fact that they're, maybe unbounded or not fully testable, not systematically testable because they're the type of the language. There may be concrete things we could take away from that paper to improve Bitcoin's protocol, but I think that means that it's potentially complicated and risky. So I think, the short term is to use lib consensus is my preference. So I wanted to...
Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think part of it also is just that keep it simple, stupid.
That's one of the arguments with the block size is working right now. And I was actually talking to Dr. Timo Henke. He has a PhD in cryptography, been involved with Bitcoin for a long time, yesterday at the Consensus conference. And he said, well, I think the burden of proof should be on the people that want to keep this limit on the block size. What do you think about that? Does the limit, would that kind of jive with what you want to do, or would that even not necessarily
in my heart of
functional
hearts,
and work?
I think everything would be just fine if the limit was completely eliminated. I think actually nothing bad would happen. I'm not convinced of that enough. I can't prove that enough to actually propose doing that. And then there are practical issues.
Well, doesn't the limit act for some existing limits that prevent different attacks?
There are. Certainly there are out-of-memory attacks that you could pull off if the block message was unlimited and you could just stream a petabyte of data to a node to make it fill out memory or disk.
So I guess we'd have to fix some of those things first before we just eliminated the block size.
Absolutely, you would.
In total.
There's engineering things you could do to fix that, but then you start getting into it's not keep it simple, stupid anymore, right? Having a limit that you know about is kind of the simplest thing you could possibly do to prevent these, to help reason about possible attacks and to test right at the limit. It's a very simple, understandable. It's very much in the keep it simple, stupid.
And we've actually, from a lot of these stress tests that have happened over the last few months, we've actually seen a lot of it's ferreted out a lot of problems that have gotten solved, whether it's the SPV mining issue, whether it's some of our SPV wallets, whether it's not having transaction fees being included in some of the wallet implementations that are out there. A lot of these, it's helped flush out and ferret out some of these problems, and we're better off for it.
It has. I think Bitcoin Core has sailed through the this so-called stress tests with flying colors. We have had, I think in the latest stress test, there may have been some kind of very low memory nodes whose memory pools filled up and they crashed and probably got automatically restarted, so it's not that huge an issue. I think we have seen more like wallet implementations that need work, that need to either be able to handle a higher transaction volume or need to respond with higher transaction fees if there's some pressure in the network.
Well, what do you think about this, Adam? I mean, are there potential threats that, because you proposed this kind of 248? Are there specific threats at 20 megabytes that would not be present at 2 megabytes?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just in the terms of, you can look at the average validation time of a block or the average memory consumption of a block, and there are some limits in the code, in the consensus code, about what constitutes a valid block, to provide resource limits or accounting for signatures and so on. But some of those are imperfect. Like, some of the logic is slightly wrong, and people have ideas about how to improve that. So I think Mark Friedenbach is going to talk about that on one of the sessions over the next few days. But it would be possible to create a kind of worst case CPU or worst case validation time. So if you could make a block that takes an hour to validate, that could be pretty dangerous. Like, maybe the guy who created it could just keep creating blocks until people decided to block him somehow, if they could. But that's why, so BIP 101, actually not in the BIP yet, but in the implementation there are some limits, and other people have proposed other limits or other ways to account for the resources more correctly and to fix some kind of DOS bugs, and also, the efficiency. Some of the format decisions make it difficult to process things efficiently, so some of those things could be fixed midterm. So I think the other thing we were talking about just a little bit ago was the full nodes ratio. So we have miners with full nodes, and so one can say something about, okay, miners could maybe get better bandwidth. I mean, apparently the Chinese miners think that 8 megabytes is a kind of hard limit for them, and I think Bitfury has come out to say that they would prefer not to have more than 2 megabytes right now. I presume that's because of their location. They go where the power is cheap, not necessarily where the bandwidth is available. But in any case, there's more scope for somebody with tens or hundreds of millions of dollars worth of ASIC equipment to do something pretty adventurous in terms of bidirectional satellite. I mean, money can buy bandwidth in some cases. But the other side of running a full node is people are running a full node to rely on it economically. So this concept that so Peter Waller put this concept to me, which is that the full nodes that people run that they rely on, so the economically dependent full nodes that power users would run, that Bitcoin merchants and hosted wallets would run, are actually the entities that enforce the consensus rules in the network. So it's they that set the consensus rules in the network, and that's kind of balances what miners can do. So if there were no full nodes in the network, sometimes when you want to explore the kind of pattern or implication of things, you take it to the extreme case and see what happens. So if there were no full nodes in the network run by users, everybody would be SPV dependent on miners, and miners could more easily get away with types of forgery, or they could group together in create types of forgery, and also there'd be an enhanced policy risk because mining is quite centralized right now, so policy could be more easily applied to miners. I mean, right now to get over 50%, it wouldn't take too many kind of court orders or something to ask them to do something.
That's better than it was like a year or two ago.
Yeah, didn't like Discus Fish or someone have like 55% or something?
I think Ghash.io
or Ghash, whoever it was.
50. It probably actually wasn't at over 50, but just because of statistical variation.
But I mean, but if somebody
before that deep bit was getting up in the 40s.
But still, I mean, if somebody controls lots of hash power, they could just point it to several different pools and then decide,
that's kind of the funny thing, right? We can kind of see where the hash power is. in the ideal distributed world, it would all be dark. We would have no idea who had how much hash power.
It's actually a feature in a way that we can, because we have some approximation of how bad it is.
Yes.
I mean, they could certainly hide that, and it may be that some of the people who got to 50% ranges chose to hide it rather than lose hash rate. We won't necessarily know, because there's often this kind of unallocated segment in the pie charts of who's doing that.
There's also the incentive to attack a pool rather than mining yourself with block withholding attacks, which is interesting. Yeah. And I noticed that it seemed like the era of the 30% mining pool, 30% public mining pool went away around the time that those papers were published, where it was pointed out that if you take some of your hashing power and you do a block withholding attack against the biggest pool, So
do you think they went away, or just that they split their pool in two halves and it got allocated on a different IP address?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
Anyway,
go ahead.
So I was going to say, it seems like, so Mark Friedenberg wrote this kind of summary of his views of the status of decentralization in Bitcoin. It's on Reddit, and it received, 140 upvotes. So apparently it struck a chord with a bunch of people. And which is just to say that Bitcoin decentralization is really kind of weak right now. I mean, you've got, big pools. There's more kind of vertically integrated mining. There are a number of miners that went bankrupt. And there are fewer suppliers of equipment that end users can buy. And, there's already the existing kind of...
Well, which pieces of that do you think the block size makes an impact on? We talked about full nodes that people run, that measure of decentralization. Certainly if the block size got high enough, we're not really sure how high.
So my point is kind of second order or more subtle, which is that, so you have economically dependent full nodes, and it's harder for them to work with increases in block size because they're consumers and they're not getting paid. Some of them are consumers, or they're small businesses or startups or what have you. And miners have a revenue stream that can supporting increased bandwidth. And so the idea is that, you've got two forms of decentralization here. So if the mining ecosystem was very decentralized, kind of going back years ago when it was like CPU or GPU mined, if it was that level of decentralized, we would, I think, as an ecosystem, the technical people would be more happy to jump the block size up to 16 megs or something, because there's lots of decentralization. And so if the mining side of things is quite centralized, then it's more important to hold on to the full node decentralization, because they're checks and balances. So mining is already too centralized. And full node centralization is also slipping a bit in the sense there are more people, there are less full nodes than before. We don't know exactly how many of them are economically dependent, because people can run full nodes that are not doing anything. They're just providing service to SPV clients, and there's a huge excess capacity of that. The SPV clients are not using that many resources. So it's hard to get a picture of it, but there seems to be a pattern of more people outsourcing.
I see that. I see there's a natural evolution as Bitcoin kind of goes professional, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at other industries, things tend to be very highly vertically integrated, and then they get more and more specialized with different people taking pieces of the industry. And so the idea that even big companies are outsourcing the running of a Bitcoin full node, I would have predicted that just as kind of normal due course, right?
In which they're doing. I mean, Chain.com just raised $30 million. We've got quite a few, like Jim, Armory, a lot of these players.
Well, if you're
that's the type of service they do, right?
If your core business is not is using the blockchain, is not managing a full node, is not that's not part of your core business, right? You just want to use the damn thing.
Right.
We see the same thing with wallets and end users, right? I run SPV wallets on my phone. I'm not going to run a full node on my phone for a lot of reasons. Even if...
What if there was 100 kilobyte block size? Then you could
I still wouldn't run it on my phone, right? No. I mean, it's just more convenient and I'm willing to do that security trade-off of running SPV mode, because most of the people I trade with I actually trust. I trust that they're not going to double spend me.
So you don't actually need to do the validation of the transactions. But, I mean, we need... I mean, but that gets to the heart of what Bitcoin is, isn't it? Like people holding their own private keys and people being able to do their own validation.
If they want to, right? I mean, it should always be possible for you to opt in to kind of audit the entire system from, beginning of time.
But I guess part of it's also this trade-off between, I mean, like me personally, I use Armory. I use Bread Wallet. I use Copay.
Yeah.
Like I use Airbits. I got a bunch of
wallets for different situations.
Well, yeah, and okay, so say my Airbits wallet were to get compromised. Well, okay, I might lose $50 in that, but I got my $50 in Copay and $50 in my Bread Wallet, right? But they're all on my iPhone instead of having the whole $150 all in one wallet. I figure it's kind of your opinion on having multiple implementations. Well, okay, there might be a bug in one or two of these other ones, and so by having distributed out the risk a little bit, with
part of this debate, I mean, I may be being unfair to the other side. I think part of this debate is I don't know what I'll call the Uber geek who has the opinion, you should want this, right? You should want this ultimate security, and I don't see things that way. I think people should have a choice, and I see it as a trade-off. I mean, there are always trade-offs with security.
But is it possible to build what we want to build with Bitcoin if we have to have the ultimate in terms of security as a foundation, and then we can decrease our use cases as we move out from that. But if we somehow erode,
well, who's we?
Well, any type of users. So like in my case, I would be using Armory for certain types of transactions, and I use Bread Wallet or Copay or Airbits and other types of transactions. Is there this need to kind of, I mean, obviously, if we can move the economic calculation for how much security somebody's willing to buy to the individuals and have multiple different implementations that they can choose from, that should help figure out like how much of the security needs to be purchased. But at the very core of Bitcoin, like if we don't have the most secure blockchain or decentralized blockchain or whatnot, doesn't that kind of impinge on some of the overall value proposition for what Bitcoin's offering?
Oh, I agree. No, I mean, Mike Hearn has interesting thoughts on how much blockchain security do we need? Will there be? I mean, the fact that there has in the history of Bitcoin basically never been a successful double spend, that might indicate that we're over secure.
And I would not be. I mean, how many? Mining is a $1 billion industry.
Yep.
I mean, are we over secured? Maybe.
I don't know. How would we decide, right? And it's really not up to us to decide as we go forward. Will that security decrease, increase? I don't know. I think we certainly need to keep it as secure as we can, and as long as we don't. If you create a ultimately secure system that nobody uses, it's useless. So there will always be some point where maybe we could do something that makes it more secure, but maybe it'll be much less attractive to people.
Well, and I mean this is a it's always about discussions. We're trading off this for that. Did you have some thoughts on this, Adam? You seem like you wanted to jump in.
I mean, I think it's interesting, Gavin, that you made that comment about you could see that, in your view, the future would look increasingly data center-like. The validation and even validation would move into the data center. And
well, not necessarily. I mean, I'm a really big technological optimist.
Okay.
So, I could imagine future smartphones and future software upgrades giving a much higher level of security than we have now, in much more decentralized way. And I think, I think we haven't explored all of the ways that you can keep a blockchain secure yet.
But let's just come back to the shorter term things then. So you just a few minutes ago said something about you could foresee that, it would over time be the case that more users would be SPV, that those would be specialized and more run by businesses, and that the trend of people, even small businesses not running full nodes. So you expressed some doubt about that.
And we see that happening right now.
Yeah. So I was pleased you said that because I want to say some things about that. And so I think it comes back to the question of what is Bitcoin. So I think the differentiator of Bitcoin is that it provides policy neutrality and it provides trustlessness so that you can, have your own private keys and it's bearer and you don't have to trust anybody. If you run a full node, you really have this kind of robust guarantee, pretty much like holding a brick of gold that you've had professionally assayed or something.
And does this kind of get to Nick Szabo kind of original BitGold proposal and Wei Dai's V-Money, and then, is this kind of, are we talking about how
I think
this has all evolved?
It's hard to infer a huge amount, but it seemed that probably I would say that Nick Szabo and Wei Dai would agree with this viewpoint because they were sort of decentralized thinking and talking about, contracting with pseudonyms and things like that. But, I think that the path that Gavin laid out is really the kind of corporatization path that moves control of Bitcoin ethos and policy out of the hands of users into companies, and that then invites policy slippage. So, if basically over time, if you drew some kind of loose graph over time, the economically dependent full nodes are reducing in number and becoming more under corporate control because there are more in data centers, and miners, we hope that improves, but whether it does or not, they're quite big right now. And it's much easier to apply policy to people who are running data centers, they've got listed companies, and apparently at the Consensus conference yesterday, I wasn't there, but somebody told me that regulators were talking about know your miner, so know your customer, know your miner. And it's kind of a worrying trend, right? Because basically the way that regulators look at the world is to identify the hierarchy, like who's in charge, and where are the kind of influence points. And if you, over time, kind of re-architect the network towards a kind of fat tree model with a hierarchical center, that presents risks. So I just see it that currently, as Mark Friedenbach has said, the network is already in a fragile state of decentralization.
I disagree with that. I think it's plenty decentralized, probably over-decentralized for resistance to regulatory pressure. And
so what about an NSL letter on, let's say, 2 or 3 miners? How is that over decentralized?
Well, what's being done to these miners? They're
receiving a court order to apply some policy or something.
Yeah, like a national security letter, like Lava BitGod or something.
For some American miners. We have plenty of miners in other countries and other jurisdictions, right? If your transactions don't get confirmed by 40% of the hash rate, there's still 60% of the hash rate that will be happy to confirm your transaction for you. If your transaction can even be identified as, one of these transactions that are going to be censored. So, as like a practical, how big a risk is it? I don't see it.
But we're also setting up a trajectory, right? So it's not that this is a kind of one-off change. So if we set up a trajectory that just sees increasing centralization, which is kind of the way you presented it, doesn't that end up as PayPal 2.0 in a data center and then you don't need to mine anyway?
Well,
you could paint a Bitcoin future that looks like that, right? You could continue mining to create the coins. You could run it in a data center.
If we keep 1 megabyte blocks, then I see an increasing centralization of kind of participation in the network. Transaction fees are going to go up, right? They have to go up. Mining can't be secure with a 1 megabyte block with 4,000 transactions unless each transaction has a huge transaction fee on it. It just can't be, right? So then you have fewer people participating directly on the Bitcoin blockchain, and it seems to me that's another form of centralization that I find much more worrying. If the only entities participating are like very high net worth, $1 million transaction entities, then those are pretty easy to get at and control.
Right, but I think it's we should be trying to scale Bitcoin in a safe way. And so I don't think anybody is saying keep it at 1 megabyte. So that's not really discussion.
So we just have where's the balance, right? Right. How do we decide what the balance is?
Yes, and so hence that kind of 248 thing, because the balance far into the future is hard to predict. Because if you go back a few years, apparently Satoshi didn't predict a number of things like mining pools, ASICs. Obviously that's predictable, but like how fast that came on, that was kind of unpredictable. Level of decentralization, reduction, speed of adoption, like the fact that miners blew through like 130 nanometers.
If he had been able to predict all that stuff, he would be an even bigger genius than he was, right?
So but I mean, that's to say that, we shouldn't assume that the next 4 years won't equally surprise us, right? During the next 4 years, perhaps we'll see nation-state players doing Bitcoin mining, or perhaps we'll see a nation-state attack Bitcoin on a policy basis. So I noticed that, the threat model that...
Or a nation-state might actually adopt Bitcoin on a policy basis.
That would change the game.
For example, the Isle of Man has been very friendly to Bitcoin companies, rolling out the red carpet and regulation to really encourage the industry to come in.
So a friend of mine has been kind of half-joking, but apparently there are people interested that Iceland should adopt Bitcoin as their national currency because they have cheap power and everybody's.
I think they're doing the opposite, right? I think Iceland is very anti-Bitcoin.
Yes, the currency controls.
Yeah, it's very anti because they're worried about using it to get around currency controls.
They really should use it to pull capital into Iceland, and Bitcoin could siphon it.
Yeah, Iceland is one of the few countries just in a kind of geopolitical balance that managed to not socialize the cost of banking failure. They actually, penalized the banks and made the shareholders of the banks
threw them in
get
jail.
The loss.
Threw some of the bankers in jail.
Yeah, imprisoned some of the bankers. So it just seems that there's, the democracy in their country. It's a smaller country. Maybe the dynamic is different, but they were able to, respect the interests of the man in the street rather than. And Iceland's a small economy as well.
Yeah, there are only 300,000 people
very large in relation to the banks, so that was something particular to their environment as well. But, again, I think this is, there's a risk of this kind of corporatization path. So, and one of the worries with that is if it fails to policy failure, it's not clear that there's a way to back out of it, right? So if you get things in a data center, there are forces at large that would like to apply policy to any form of payment. We know this, right? And Bitcoin's differentiator is basically that particular part, that it's policy neutral, and it must remain policy neutral to be interesting because, if you want to run a central server thing, there are things like that, right? There are competing, not even cryptocurrency things that can do that.
Yeah, but nobody's proposing, right, scaling up so quickly that it requires a data center to...
Yeah, but doesn't... But you're talking about it... So if we take the block size from 1 megabyte to 20 megabytes, or even to 8 megabytes, even though it's an 8x increase, it's still a block of that size every 10 minutes, so it's going to grow even more exponentially, right?
There are a whole bunch of software optimizations that are in the queue, in the air, being worked on, that mean that transaction volume of 8 megabytes worth of transactions every 10 minutes and would be the kind of flow, so that 8 megabytes really is spread out over the time.
Over like the 10-minute period.
Over the 10-minute period. And it's not one big block being announced, right? There are optimized block protocols. There's already Matt Corallo's optimized relay protocol, which I believe most blocks are transmitted in one packet. One Ethernet packet. New block announcements go out. And all the miners are using that to optimize their orphan rates. So, and those kinds of protocols, there's even, I've done work to kind of research future versions of that would support much, much, much larger blocks. So I think from a software engineering standpoint, we understand how we will get over the problem that miners are complaining about of, I have high orphan rates for large blocks. We will get past that problem, and that just won't be part of the argument anymore.
Well, and
I'll say a couple of things about those things. So one of them is you can't really rely on the relay network to make an argument about there are different types of attacks people can do, but the relay network is very efficient in the best case scenario. But in an attack scenario, it doesn't help at all, in a sense, right? Because people can intentionally create a block full of non-relay transactions if they see
I've lost track
advantage of doing that.
Of if that is ever an economically rational attack.
I think it would certainly
I've
amplify
heard
selfish mining. For
and
example.
I've heard that selfish mining, it might make selfish mining marginally worse. We're not seeing selfish mining anyway, partly because to selfish mining more than 30% of hash power, and all the pools are under 20%. It looks like, unless they're doing some secret dark mining. But we're not seeing it in practice on the network. So I don't know. I wonder how much we should really worry about that.
Okay, so another thing was you mentioned kind of headroom within protocols. So in terms of further optimizing the base protocols, the network protocols and things. So one of them was the amount of time it takes to join a new node to the network and sync it up.
Yeah, I know. I know. We get it all the time with new users on Armory, and it's the size of the blockchain growing. It just is constantly increasing this cost for new users.
I think there's a presentation on this over the next few days. Patrick Straitman is going to say something about the analysis of that. But what I wanted to say was about there have been apparently, I think, 4 separate periods in history during Bitcoin that the amount of time it took to sync a block, to sync up to the network, crept up to 24 hours. And then some big kind of re-architectural optimizations were made and it shrunk down to an hour or so. And so we're now on the last one of those, which was the headers first kind of major refactor that Peter Wooler did. And what he's saying is that basically we're out of ideas. The list of optimizations for that particular problem are almost all played out. There might be a small factor left. But so, there is, when you're talking about bandwidth trends, there's headroom from, technology and physics and stuff. But when you're talking about software, architecture stuff, short of snarks and kind of new technologies, you've got a wish list and apparently some of them we're basically at the bottom of the wish list and there isn't much more we can do. So that kind of creates now a kind of stretching off into the future question about how long it will take to sync a block. Anyway, that's a kind of maybe a secondary question because you can...
I guess I had a more immediate question for Gavin about just the ripeness of the whole debate. Why is this so important right now? We got tons of things on the to-do list, tons of things that as an investor involved with several companies, I got a lot of things that I want everybody working on. Why is this such an important topic, or is it even?
Well, I say that it's urgent, and I use urgent in kind of security terms, right? Security issues can be critical. It means you have to absolutely, positively drop everything you're doing and fix them right now. They can be urgent, which is it needs to happen, right? You don't need to drop everything you're doing right now. There is time to fix it, but it's an issue that definitely needs to be fixed. And I think this is an urgent problem because any fix will take at least 6 months, probably longer, to actually roll out onto the network and have happen. We've seen consensus, the discussion and consensus process is taking a very long time. People have lots of different ideas on exactly what should be done. And so far, I haven't heard a clear consensus on how much is too much, how much is not enough. Where's the happy medium that everybody can be kind of equally unhappy and come to consensus and move forward. But in the meantime, transaction volume is steadily going up and up and up. And my worry is that there will never be some critical event where we say, okay, now is the time. It'll just be.
It's like boiling the frog.
It's like boiling a frog. Yeah, it's that kind of problem where 4 years from now we may look back and say, where did all the users go? They went to something that was less expensive. They went to something that was more
I mean, if
reliable.
they're filling up the block size and paying mining fees, I mean, obviously we've got users and they're finding enough value and usefulness from the protocol that they're paying to get included.
You hit the 1 megabyte limit, things start to get unreliable. Transaction fees start to go up.
Yeah,
People start to go away.
And that's another point that Timo Henke had raised, is that we actually, we don't even want to be bumping up against that limit of the block. We want to have at least like 10, 20, 30% of extra space in the blocks, so that we have this excess capacity in case there are big, massive spikes that come in. I mean, is that needed?
That is needed. And I mean, blocks are found randomly. If you've used Bitcoin, sometimes.
Oh yeah, sometimes. Yeah.
Your transaction takes 10 seconds to confirm because a block happened to be found.
And the pool got lucky.
Everybody's happy. Exactly. And sometimes it takes an hour. And so we have these natural variations where transactions will back up. So we'll never ever get to 100% full blocks. Just because every once in a while, miners will get lucky and find 6 blocks in 6 minutes, and that will just clear out all the transaction blocks.
So you were talking about it taking quite a while to arrive at consensus. So in terms of the technical community arriving at a single proposal or compromise or a plan for some period of time, 2 years, 4 years, 20 years, whatever that might be. So I guess there are something like 6 main proposals, maybe a few extras. So
yeah, and I wanted to push on you about that, because I'm curious. You've got a bunch of individuals at Blockstream. I think there have been 2, there'll probably be 3 proposals coming out of Blockstream for how to address this problem. If you can't even get consensus inside Blockstream, how do we get consensus in the wider community?
So, Blockstream hired a bunch of people who were working on core, and this is also true for yourself and Jeff, for example, right?
Yeah.
So Blockstream is not an entity that's, trying to control or take a position in this. So I think that's to be expected. But in terms of the technical community reaching a consensus on a protocol, you want to keep it kind of cordial and professional and work together, and that's partly what these workshops are about. But so I just wanted to put it to you, or kind of push back on the idea of going a step further and developing one of them and then encouraging people to use it. So you talk to companies, you encourage them to use it, and then you have XT running in the network, and people are starting to mine it.
And that comes out of my experience of trying to get the developers. It's like herding cats, right? I've said, get 10 developers in a room, ask them to solve this problem, and you'll wind up with 11 different solutions. I think that's probably actually an underestimate. I think it went up at 20.
Seeing that one.
And so, it comes down to, a governance question of how do you get these cats to agree? And the only solution, the only kind of way forward I saw is to actually release some code and then encourage people to vote with their feet and run the code, because that is what Bitcoin consensus is what code are people running?
I don't agree really. I think that it's the code that people are running, but I think the network can't support, the consensus algorithm can't support computing consensus algorithms bouncing around in the network. If you want to do a hard fork upgrade to Bitcoin, you don't want to have some kind of network war going on. You want everybody to agree on what the mechanism is and upgrade to it in a calm, sensible way at the same time. So again, I think the concern I have is that it was perceived, whether by intent or not, as a as a non-constructive step to deploy it into the network. Does that mean that people should pay more attention to BIP 101 versus BIP 100? I know miners picked that up, but I don't think Jeff encouraged them to particularly. I wouldn't know. But, there are some other proposals, for example, like 103 or FlexCap.
The deployment for BIP 101, the plan was always to go to merchants, exchanges. There seems to be reasonably broad consensus among the user community. When I say reasonably broad, if you look at polls on, back when I was proposing 20 megabyte blocks, informal polls on Bitcoin Talk or on the Reddit showed that, a super majority of users seemed to think that it was a reasonable idea. But then to go to merchants, and that's why you saw this, letter from some of the big merchants and exchanges saying, we like BIP 101, we're going to support bigger blocks. And that's the order of the order that things need to proceed in. I was very surprised that I couldn't get consensus among the developer community. And I mean, it was a question of, do the developers matter for this decision, right? I mean, how much should their opinion be weighed? I mean, certainly, technical opinions about attacks and vulnerabilities we need to listen really carefully to. But that can always be taken too far, right? You can always imagine some weird space aliens come down and attack something that, it just isn't going to happen. But I don't know, that's something I've been thinking about recently is, what is the role of the people who work on the code? They know a lot about code. Sometimes I think they don't know a whole lot about economics. Sometimes I think maybe they misjudge what businesses want, maybe what miners want. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, what do you see the role of...
Just a little editorial note, a little bit later at dinner, we were all discussing, and Gavin said he didn't really mean exactly what he said a little bit later here, so don't give him too much grief, but we did think that the overall section was good to keep included. Thanks. The
developers in this whole consensus building process.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we got to build stuff that people are willing to pay for, that consumers are willing to use, that investors are willing to buy and speculate and hold on. I mean,
if I'm being snarky, and I don't mean snark in the... If I'm being snarky, right, I mean, if the current set of developers can't create a secure Bitcoin network that can handle the equivalent of, 4 average web pages every 10 minutes, then maybe they should be fired. Right? I mean, that's kind of the...
Whoa, take it easy there.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, that does raise a good point because, Blockstream's raised $21 million. Money follows management. They've raised a lot of money to build out and develop this. And who else has raised money to work on the core protocol? We got a lot of these users that are using the core protocol, but how much code are they writing? And how much
what is a chronic
how many salaries are they paying to get this code writing? Or are they just free writing off of the work that's being done by, Blockstream or some of the other ones?
All open source software projects. We saw this with OpenSSL, right? Which was, horrifically underfunded, and it's probably still...
And had a massive security vulnerability. Sure.
Yeah.
So I mean, money follows management. I think it's a great. I think it's a very valid point. We need accountability and responsibility, and people building stuff that the users, the investors want to use. But you also this stuff doesn't. And we've been talking about it. It's very complicated work. It's very complex, and it doesn't just write itself.
Yeah.
So, who's going to pay developers to get this stuff written?
So, I mean, I think it's maybe significantly unfair to say that the developer should be fired or something, because basically the network would have broken multiple times if you tens of thousands of hours.
And that really is unfair of me.
And the market hasn't fired him. In fact, the market's given him $21 million of funding to build out the core stuff. So I mean, the market's voted. There's the scoreboard, $21 million.
Well, apart from that, I mean, I just think that it's a complicated area. So it's maybe not the most productive thing. If you think about Bitcoin as something like the digital signature standard or the OpenSSL, like the SSL protocol or something, consensus rules are complicated. It took the technical community quite a while to digest the implications of the selfish mining paper. And people were coming out with all kind of counter proposals of maybe we can fix it like this, or maybe it isn't really an issue. And I'm not sure that we have a full understanding of the implications today. So I don't think we can just, turn around and give users a political vote as if it's a free parameter, right? I mean, it's maybe like in SSL saying, in the early days, encryption was computationally expensive. So if you turn around to the users and say, do you want to complain about 128-bit keys and say we want to chop them in half to 64 and see if you can get like a popular vote on that. Maybe you could have succeeded, but it wouldn't have been an appropriate way to do protocol design. So, without being elitist, I think it's, the implications for decentralization and policy and the risks of getting into a kind of corporatist race where all of that ends up in a data center and there are, policy attacks that happen on it that we can't undo. I think that's a serious thing because that's basically the reason for existence for Bitcoin, or Bitcoin becomes a poor imitation of its former self if it ends up as PayPal 2.0 and it's all centralized. And I think it's naive to expect that policy won't creep in if there are policy points because, we haven't seen a lot of kind of high impact.
They've already crept in, right? The exchanges are a huge policy point that are being watched, that are reporting, that are...
well, you're going to be compliant or you're going to go to jail, like Charlie Shrimp.
Yep, exactly.
I mean, it's that simple.
It is that simple.
Right, but so, the way that the exchanges work is that it acts like a cash rail. So the exchanges act as the people depositing and withdrawing cash. So in banking terms, if you deposit a large amount of cash, you have to report that. You have to make suspicious activity reports. And so you see that mirrored in the exchanges. But, we do want Bitcoin itself to act as the gold bar and, for payment policy neutrality to persist for the long term, because I think it's unrealistic in a global arena to expect, if too much policy creeps into it, you break fundability or simply can't send money anymore, which is the current problem today with the existing banking network, that as you cross national borders, it becomes more expensive or difficult to even route money to certain places.
Yeah, so
Bitcoin offers finally the possibility of a neutral level playing field. So I just think that, it's being too populist to turn to people who frankly don't understand the implications. Like, some people might find that elitist, but I disagree. It's just very, very complicated. The people writing the code, trying to understand these things, it's bleeding edge stuff, right? So it's not like a free parameter that we can just tinker with. And the network is already quite centralized. I share Mark Friedenbach's view. And the kind of balance between miners running full nodes and full nodes, economically dependent full nodes, doing the auditing, you need one or the other of those to be strong, right? So we've already got the mining at a weak place, so we certainly don't want to stress it further and weaken the full node auditors. So if the kind of bit fury statistics are showing that as you increase the block size, it will push people off the network, and people's network connections are not just dedicated all day long to run, Bitcoin. They have to exist with VoIP and YouTube streaming and kids playing games and stuff. And if it starts to be inconvenient or it pushes their bandwidth cap and they get
So it's an empirical question, right? I mean, you're okay with 248. I would like to see 8, 16, 32, 64.
Up to 8 gigs, right?
In 20 years when, we're all running iPhone.
Yeah, if we've
11s.
got the bandwidth and the hardware that can support something like that.
Yeah, and if miners choose to create blocks that big, right?
Yeah.
And part of the reason why I think actually eliminating the block size is because miners will not create blocks that big unless they can handle the bandwidth and transactions worldwide.
So also you expressed surprise that the developers didn't immediately go along with the proposal, but I was surprised that they didn't see it as a priority. Right, so back in January, I started pushing privately. Come on, back. In Puerto Rico, you saw.
But this has been an issue for how many years?
Years.
We've been talking about this for years. I mean, even when the discussion happened to put the block size cap in there in the first place, I mean, there was discussion that this is going to create a cat fight later on. So here we are.
Well, the good news is I think everybody thinks it is a priority now. We are talking about it.
We're definitely putting forth some massive brain power.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, as kind of an investor, I'm obviously going to look to the subject matter experts like you two and lots of our other brilliant minds in the area. But I also kind of look at. I want to step back and look at the larger picture. We have a symphony going on. And it's almost like this discussion has become one key on the piano that's just getting banged over and over and over and over again. And now everybody's just so frustrated with it. Like we've almost broken the key, with censorship on the subreddit, the fracturing in the community. Now it's spilling over into the mainstream press. That's shaking confidence. People are laughing at us and the way we think we're getting stuff done. I wonder if it's like impeded or stopped even some investment funding rounds, because it's shaken confidence in the community and like faith in some of the stuff that's happening. And we're talking about people's livelihoods here, like whether there's still going to be a job there for people or not, or whether these startups will actually get created or not. So, I mean, it is definitely a very serious topic, and I don't know that it's easily resolved. Obviously we've been fighting about it for a long time.
Tricky thing. I don't see an easy way to resolve it. There's no one person who's going to make the decision. Whatever happens, I don't know. Maybe after the conclusion of this workshop, I'll drive home with a big smile on my face and feel confident that we will have some reasonable compromise that everybody will be happy with. That's my hope.
In normal political situations, to arrive at a conclusion, you have to be at the table, right? So you have a bunch of people negotiating around the table. In some places, they get to kind of political situations where they're not even talking to each other, and then they have talks about talks.
You just kind of said that a bunch of people you don't want to be at the negotiating table, though, because they don't really understand the issues deeply enough.
No,
right?
But I mean, I was referring to the... Yeah, so I mean, if you've got a contentious technical topic, I don't think it really helps the topic to turn technical parameters over to the public to vote on them. But just in terms of getting the technical folks to agree on a proposal, which seems like the first step to me, as Trace said, now we have Bitcoin company representatives talking in the media and saying different things, or signing conflicting letters, or mining different versions, incompatible things in the network, which is not a good idea, in my opinion. If you want a technical community to reach a consensus, the technical community have to be around the table, and I feel that potentially XT has walked away from the table. Start a new table.
Oh, I would. I mean, but Gavin's here, like talking on the podcast, is here, participating in the debate. He's at the Scaling Bitcoin workshop.
Fair enough.
I mean, Bitcoin XT's mined one block out of the last 1,000. So I mean, it's not like it's gotten huge uptake or been causing much problem for the actual network.
I think that it's a mistake to think about it as a minor popularity, because
I agree with that.
I mean, actually,
and it's got like 12% of the nodes or something like that.
Zero lobbying of miners, right? I want to talk to exchanges, merchants, users, right? Get the economic majority agreeing this is a reasonable thing to do, and then it's time to go to the miners and say the economic majority thinks this is the right way to go. Then try to get miners on board.
So I agree with those two steps, but I think we missed the first step, which is getting the technical community to agree on some parameters. Because by skipping over that step, it antagonizes the technical community, surely, right? Yeah, we talked about this before you released XT.
You're right, and it might have been a mistake. But I just didn't see any... From where I sit, I heard a clear chorus, a clear symphony from all of the merchants, exchanges, users, even the miners, that we want bigger blocks. But I don't hear that same symphony for exactly how to accomplish that among the technical community. And frankly, I don't...
Well, because it's a hard problem to solve.
I think it's an easy problem to solve. It's just there are multiple possible solutions, and there's no clear way to decide which one is best. And so, you get engineers arguing about it, and they'll never agree.
Yeah.
So, what do you do?
So, they talk about it, right?
And nothing gets done.
Well, okay, I mean, so
there needs to be a deadline. There needs to be some process for coming to a decision.
I mean, maybe the way to look at it is things are where they are, and look at it as water under the bridge, and say, okay, now we have a bunch of proposals.
Yeah.
What should we do? So I chucked one over the wall, like how about 248, which is not my idealized parameters personally, but just something that respects and pays attention to figures in the network. If you
can get everybody at Blockstream to agree to that, if you can get consensus there, then I think that would be like a good straw poll of like developer consensus, right? I mean, if you guys, I assume you communicate all the time, like closely, you know each other, you like each other, right? If you know you could get those cats herded, then I think I'd be more optimistic that the wider development community could come to consensus.
So I mean, Jeff Garzik had a similar proposal like BIP 102. Which is just a straight 2 megabyte, and I think that's kind of too short term. I think 248 is
I think
better.
everybody hates that, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, I talked about it with him in terms of comparing 248 to 2, and he's saying, well, yeah, 2 was my proposal to do something like that, but I think 248 is, okay, it lasts a bit longer, it shows some growth, and it creates some time to do work on more complicated things.
Like
we haven't
Lightning
talked about
Network,
Lightning at all, right?
Lightning Network. And
so hopefully within 4 years, we could see the effects of some of those things, like find out, do they work as we expected? What's the rate of recirculation, which is kind of how efficient it is? I mean, theoretically, it looks like it should work. The base technology we know works because it's going way back to the...
In practice, if people are only doing 2 recirculates, then it's actually a net negative. So, I mean, there's all these...
Right. So, but I mean, people are like, there are, I guess, 3, maybe 4 companies working on it right now, multiple alpha implementations. So people are pretty excited and working hard on it. And
Lightning's really exciting, right? If I was a VC or investor, I'd take a look at Lightning and I'd be really excited.
Yeah, I mean, I actually ran into both Joseph and Thaddeus yesterday at the Consensus, and I was like, I got to interview you guys for the podcast because everybody is just ranting and raving about
Lightning.
Lightning.
Very, 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 very insanely cool. We'll solve a whole bunch of problems if it actually
So I mean, that's...
works and doesn't violate the keep it simple, stupid too much, right? It is more complicated.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin is complicated. Sometimes we have to suck it up and make the magic work so that it's, as long as its interface is simple, people don't care. I mean, they push the button on all kinds of complicated machines today and have no idea how they work. So
but security-wise, right? I mean,
I agree.
It's better. So there are all sorts of... I'm sure there'll be edge cases in Lightning that are uncomfortable and sharp. But anyway...
Yeah, I mean, we got to get to dinner. We've gone way over our time. But, I'd just like to thank the two of you, absolute legends in the Bitcoin space, showing us how to have a civil, professional discussion on tough topics. Thanks so much for being with us. We've had Gavin Andresen and Dr. Adam Back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Trace.
Be sure to get a copy of the free Bitcoin Guide at freebitcoinguide.com. Got a question or suggestion? Record your voice at bitcoin.kn. Don't be shy. To help the show, share bitcoin.kn with friends, post about it on Reddit, and otherwise spam the interwebs. Your iTunes comments and 5-star reviews are very important to us. Please continue tuning in to the Bitcoin Knowledge Podcast, where we release interviews with the top people in the Bitcoin world. Now take some choline and let that Bitcoin knowledge consolidate.